Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kavutskiy here for Chess.com, and today I'm going to be showing you guys a really interesting game that I played late last year. What's great about this game is that it's a very instructive example of how a lot of times you can sacrifice a pawn or even two pawns in the opening because for that small investment you gain a large lead in development over your opponent, and you can use that development advantage to create an initiative and eventually create decisive threats and win the game. So the game here was against a strong player who's now an international master, and he played kind of an odd move against my French defense. He played b3. So after d5, bishop b2, this is white's point. He just wants to sacrifice this e4 pawn, and he's eventually going to win it back. And white is just trying to, in some cases, avoid the standard closed position that you get in the French defense by developing his bishop on this long diagonal and trying to keep the position open. So I play knight f6, and here I'm trying to induce white to play e5 so that I can play knight d7 and then get a structure that I'm comfortable with. In the French defense, black is often very comfortable with a closed structure in the center, which he can then attack from the side and put pressure on white's center. And here my opponent decided to take on d5. So he's sticking to his main idea, which is to keep the position open. I took here, and now queen e2 check. This is a really tricky move. The first idea is that the natural bishop e7 runs into bishop takes f6, and black is forced to recapture with the pawn. And although this pawn structure might be okay for black, I wasn't exactly sure about this position and I didn't really want to try it. So I decided to look for another option, and I chose the move bishop e6. So this avoids the double pawns on f6, but it does have its own drawback. And that drawback is that white can now play queen b5 check, which is what happened in the game. And as you can see, black is losing the b7 pawn. Of course, I didn't blunder this move. I instead chose to go for this position because I figured that I'm going to get an advantage in development, and white is going to waste a lot of time taking this pawn on b7 while I'm getting all my pieces out, and I can try to create and manifest an initiative and attack the white king. So I play knight d7, and if white doesn't take this pawn on b7, then there's no point of giving this check, so of course he took. And now rook b8. So I got 3 pieces out in exchange for giving up this one pawn, which I think is generally a pretty good trade. And here, if white takes a second pawn on a7, now I'm getting my 4th piece out, and this bishop on c5 is very strong, mainly because it's attacking this really weak pawn on f2. White's poor development is really going to be an issue for him. For example, queen a4, I can play knight e4. And it's impossible to defend this f2 pawn, and if white plays something like d4, black has this resource rook b4. Queen goes to a6, and rook takes d4. And the idea is that after white takes my rook and I recapture, I'm threatening to win his rook, and I'm also threatening this pawn on f2. His king will be very dangerously exposed in the center, and black will just have a pretty much decisive attack. So it's not necessary to see all of that before playing bishop e6, sacrificing the b7 pawn, but you should trust that if you're getting all your pieces out very quickly, that you will be able to find tactical resources later on based on your lead in development. So my opponent here played queen a6, and this is probably the best practical decision for white, right? What white should be doing here is trying to finish his development as soon as possible, and if he's able to complete his development, then he'll have an extra pawn, and because of that, he'll have a huge advantage. So as black here, I'm trying to both develop my pieces very quickly and possibly create threats so that white cannot comfortably finish his development. So I played bishop d6, and now my opponent played d4. I'm not sure about this move. I think maybe knight c3 would have been better, right? Just developing pieces towards the center, trying to control some squares so that black isn't able to create huge threats. But he played d4, just trying to control some squares in the center, which is also okay, but this move doesn't really develop any pieces, and it blocks his bishop. So maybe not the best move here. And now I simply castled. And of course now black wants to play rook e8 and try to create some discovered attack on the white king along the e-file, which of course is very dangerous. So white played queen d3. So rook e8. Black's plan here is very simple. He just wants to finish his development, and at some point he's going to start activating his pieces. So rook e8 is one move. This knight can jump to e4 or g4 at some point. Then the queen can come out. I also have an idea to play c5 and try to completely open up the center. Right? Because I'm better developed, opening up the center will almost always be really good for black in this position because all of his pieces are already active and participating in the game. So bishop e2 and c5. Knight f3. And now white is ready to castle, which means black really needs to create some threats very soon. And I came up with this move, knight h5. So the point of this move is that the knight is getting ready to jump to f4, after which it's going to put a lot of pressure on white's position. It's going to be attacking the queen, the bishop, and also this pawn on g2, which will be a huge target once white castles kingside. For example, already if white just castle in this position, I think black is simply winning after something like knight f4, queen e2, and bishop g4. And the bishop here is attacked, so if something like, let's say, rook e1, then I think black can simply create a decisive attack with like knight takes e2 check, rook takes, and bishop takes f3. And once white recaptures with his pawn on f3, his king side is going to be completely destroyed, and at some point I'm going to bring my queen out to h4 and simply checkmate white on the king side. Note here that white is still really underdeveloped, and these pieces on the queen side just can't contribute to the defense at all, which means effectively black is just playing with more force because his pieces are developed and creating threats. So that means white has to do something to respond to this knight f4 threat. A move like g3 is really undesirable because then I'll play bishop h3, preventing my opponent from castling, and I'll build up in the center and I'll open up the center, and white's king will be pretty much a sitting duck. So my opponent here played bishop c1. And now if knight f4, he's simply going to trade off his bishop and he might be able to get his king to safety. So here I decided to take on d4. And the reason I'm playing this move is because this pawn on d4 was restricting my d7 knight. Okay, after I eliminate this pawn on d4, now this knight can jump to e5 and c5, activate itself, and attack more of white's pieces. The more of my pieces I can activate, obviously, the better. And here my opponent played a smart move. He castled. Right? So now in this position, technically black has equalized the material. I'm not down a pawn anymore. But of course this pawn on d4 is very weak, and white can pretty much take it whenever he wants. So it was a good idea to castle first, get the king to safety, and then worry about taking this pawn on d4. So I'm still in the same position I was before. If white can complete his development and take this pawn on d4, then black is going to be down a pawn with very little to show for it. So I have to continue to stay aggressive. And now I play queen c7. I think this is a smart move. I'm putting pressure on h2, and I'm trying to induce my opponent to make a weakness to his king, something like g3 or h3. And that's exactly what happened. My opponent played g3. And now if he's not careful, at some point I might be able to sacrifice a piece or two on g3 to open up his king. And that's the point of playing this move, queen c7. Induce a weakness on the king side so I have a target for my active pieces. Now I play knight c5. So this knight is getting into the game. And here, white should probably take this pawn on d4 now. And after my planned move, bishop h3, I think white should simply give up this rook and try to complete its development and play something like knight c3. And black will basically get his material back, but at least in this position, black doesn't have any immediate threats, and white is very close to finishing his development. And with a piece and a pawn for the rook, I think white has a pretty good position, especially since this pawn on d5 is also very weak, and white has now, at this point, good control over the center with his pieces. Instead, my opponent decided to play queen d1. So I think he was hoping to take on d4 with the knight, but this is simply too optimistic, right? There's no way white's going to have enough time in this position to get everything he wants. And I think he wanted to take on d4 with the knight and then slowly develop his pieces and not lose any material, which is a lot to ask for since black has basically completed his development already and ready to start launching a strong attack. So bishop h3, and of course this bishop is very active on h3 and very troubling to the white king. And now definitely white should leave this rook on f1 and play knight takes d4. I think this is absolutely necessary. Just give back some material and complete your development. That's the most practical defense you can do. If they're only up a little bit in material and they're not making threats, then you can continue the game and play on and make a fight out of it. But instead, my opponent here played rook e1, trying to hold on to his extra material. And this is a big mistake. And I found the very strong move, knight e4. And the reason this move is so strong and effectively ends the game is that all my pieces are now pressuring this g3 pawn, and there's no way white can actually stop black from sacrificing here, opening up his king and checkmating. Okay, my next move is pretty much knight takes f2, and then after king takes f2, I'm going to play bishop takes g3 check. Right, with the idea that if he takes my bishop, I play queen takes g3 with mate, and if he doesn't take my bishop, then I'm just going to take this pawn on h2 anyways, and because all my pieces are there on the king side, black is pretty much mating in all the variations. If you want to work it out for yourselves, I strongly recommend you do. For one, it's a lot of fun, right? Just looking at all these different variations where black is checkmating the white king. And the second reason, which is probably more important, is that you get to train your tactical eye a little bit, looking at all these sacrifices and different mating patterns. So my opponent here played knight g5. There's pretty much nothing else white can really do here. If he plays a move like queen takes d4, he can play something like bishop c5 and take this pawn on f2. So knight g5 was played, trying to trade off my strong knight on e4, but of course, as promised, I just took on f2. And now if king takes f2, bishop takes g3 check, and this simply leads to mate. For example, king g1, bishop takes h2, king h1, knight g3 check, king h2, knight f1 double check, and next queen g3 with mate. And here my opponent was very short on time, so he just played queen d2, just a random move. And of course I took this pawn on g3, and after knight f3, bishop takes h2 check, he resigned. The point is, any move he makes, I'm just going to play queen g3 next with checkmate. So I hope this game was instructive to you guys and showing how you can, a lot of times, just sacrifice a pawn in the opening, get a lead in development, finish your development, activate your pieces, create threats, create weaknesses in your opponent's position, and eventually your initiative will pay off and you'll be able to crash in. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.